what is the value of an interview based on your experience both as a journalist and a storyteller? Why conduct an interview? Why go down that path of spending time with another person?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess why do an interview? I think it's the same answer that you would give to why talk to anyone, really. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why one would sit down. I mean, we're all lonely and stuck in our own heads, and it's sometimes really nice to try to get out of our brains and project our attention outward to another person. People are much, much weirder and stranger than I think we realize. Like, we wildly overestimate our ability to get in one another's head.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's why I do interviews, because I always feel my ideas of the world get small until I ask a question, and then they get big again.
Such a great word, stranger, right? That people are strangers to us, that we are strange to them. What I hear you talking about is also, though, this sort of stranger as in an unknown, right? Like, there's so much unknown about that person.
Yeah.
And that we have a fixed set of notions or schema or frames that we think we know them, but that in identifying them as weird or strange, that you're helping us to understand that we don't know, and that this is a chance to be super curious.
I would almost take the opposite approach, which is to say that in every interview, there's a homecoming. There's an assumption that we don't know this person, and then you find so much more that you identify with and recognize in them. Mm-hmm. And so it's how unstrange, how familiar the stranger is. There's just no one on earth that there isn't an interesting question to ask of, or who can show us something new about themselves and about us in the process.
In the process.
Right, and I think it's also important just to state that if you're interviewing somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing them. It doesn't mean you even have to like them or agree with them. It just means you're sharing this moment and you're exploring one another's mind. And I think so. There's a pressure that I think can sometimes enter into interview situations, particularly with those that are different from us, that we've got to sort of hold them to account. And yes, if you are a politician, you need to hold those people to account. But if you're just two people, doing an interview is not endorsing them. It's just simply like, what is it like to be you? How did you get to be you? You know, which is a different thing. I mean, that I think you can do without any sort of sense of moral or political compromise.
Yeah.
How do you each structure the kind of going in plan so that you're not too rigid, but that you're also not so loose and so open that the person you're interviewing feels that either it's too freewheeling, or you're just sort of throwing it into the wind, right?
I think there's a proportion where you want to have some stuff that you know, like some stories that you want to go and get from the person. And so that's where you start to organize it into these chapters of like, oh, well, there's this anecdote we can begin with, maybe how they got into what they do. And then there's a decisive moment in people's lives where they became who they are. And usually that's a series of stories or a story. Let's do that. But then there might be 3 or 4 things that are more just like honest curiosities. And you go in with that as well. And you don't know where that's going to go. And so for me, I always think that there's a tension at work in every interview where you've got to prepare.
Yeah, because it's a form of respect.
Absolutely. They don't have a ton of time, and neither do you, frankly. So let's get to actual business. So you prepare, but then you also have to listen. And those two things can sometimes operate against each other. Because if you're so wed to your paper, I've got to get this question and then this question, you might miss an amazing thing or a troubling thing that the person said. So you've always got to be sort of like with your prep, but also in the moment.
Prep and listening enough space, right? So that you're not leaping in with the next question before that person has really, truly finished that thought, right? Like that whole idea of take a beat, right? That you're giving that more air, you're holding it more loosely.
Yeah, and one of the first things you learn when you're doing interview is let the uncomfortable pause hang. Silence is good. feels weird. Everything in our culture trains us not to allow that and to fill it, but just let it go, because the person you're talking to will end up filling it. So the music of an interview can sometimes feel slower than the music of life in a way.
How great.
But I think that's good. You have to lean into that.
Great. I love that image.
The single most powerful thing you can do as an interviewer is actually not ask a question, is to just listen and linger in the silence and let there be space for the person to speak, even when you're inclined to happen with a, reaction or something.
Right.
But if done well, an interview, if you are showing up with so much interest, they will almost forget that you're there because they are being so lavish.
It's very flattering
It's
when
very
someone's
flattering.
interested.
Yeah.
We all want to be witnessed.
Yeah.
We all want to be understood.
Yeah.
And when you are given the opportunity to be asked about your life for 30 minutes or an hour, there's no greater show of kindness, respect,
Yeah.
even love.
Yeah.
And so to know that this is a way of honoring someone's life story, to ask them questions about it and listen.
I wonder if I could ask you a question.
Sure.
Because we were talking beforehand about sort of the act of listening,
Yes.
and there are many different things that you might be listening to or for in an interview. I'm wondering how you balance, and this is, I guess, a question both for you as an interviewer, but also for you as a scientist. How do you balance what they are saying, listening for what they're saying, versus listening for the thing they're not saying, or the stuff that's below the level of the conversation?
I love that texture of the conversation where I feel kind of my brain operating at two levels. One is tracking what the person's actually saying, and the other is tracking this spidey sense that I have a question, or the person who is not me, who's in my imagination as the audience, might have a question, or that the person speaking has something that they're just about to say. One thing that makes me think, or one question that makes me have, is, and then I ask that question, is that, and I think it's important for me every time that happens to be very clear. I could be completely wrong.
Yeah.
This is just something that's popped into mind. Maybe this is, a wild card and isn't what you were thinking or isn't right. And I think that also is helpful for me to set myself in a position of, I could be totally wrong, but this makes me think of X.
Yeah.
Putting it out there, and some of the time it has been the case that the person said, no, that's not really, that's not where I was going with that. But occasionally it does open that sort of space.
I hear you describing 3 strategies for interviewing that I employ, and I hear you employ in your interviews so beautifully, Jad. And one is the say more.
Yes.
Elaborate. I'd love to hear more on that.
That is actually
keep
one of the
going.
best questions. Like, that thing you said, can you say more?
Say more.
It's just so simple.
Literally. Like,
so
you
simple.
just imagine
So
the
simple.
camera opening wider.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. It's amazing how much, it expands the aperture. And then the other is, I think I hear you saying this.
Yeah.
And maybe, so what you're saying, instead of what you're saying is this, it's, I think I hear this. Am I right? Am I interpreting this correctly? Which is you actively showing, I want to be sure I understand what you're saying well.
Yeah.
And that I faithfully represent it in, this piece I'm writing.
Yeah.
And that often, getting it wrong, I find, if you misinterpret what they're saying, can often generate the most interesting part of the interview,
Yeah.
where
So
they're correcting
interesting.
you.
So
I think I
interesting.
may or may not. Am I getting this right?
Yeah.
It's that makes them feel not only seen, but also puts them in the authority to let me explain this to you better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially with science interviews or someone who has a very technical background and
Yeah.
job.
Sharper language,
Yes.
more clarity.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Things come into focus, right?
And then,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, the third key best advice I have for interviewing that's kind of implicit in that is could you give me an example? Best question to ask. Say more. I think what I hear you saying is, and could you give me an example? Or take me into an experience where you learned that. Tell me the story of that.
Yeah. And Amanda, how do I, or rather, how do you manage the other portion of the distribution of emotional and sensory experience, which is you get the sense that the person's about to say or is saying something really hard or upsetting, perhaps a little scary. Where or how do you pick up those signals, and what do you do with that information? How do you navigate?
If you are getting to the point in the interview where you have to ask the difficult question, often you know they're sort of waiting for it, you're waiting for it, and that's and it's kind of a relief by that point to get to it. But I would address it maybe not with direct confrontation, but with I understand that there has been some controversy about this perspective that you have. And I wonder what you think about that. What's your response to it? How would you describe that controversy? How did you come to arrive at a perspective that has become controversial? What's informed that?
Interesting. So I hear you saying, tell me if this is right, that you sort of zoom out to that third person perspective, like helping that person see it and speak about it from a more distanced perspective.
Great way of putting it. Yes, you zoom out.
But you're doing something else sorry to interrupt, but it's something that's very interesting in what you're doing that I just want to name, is that you're not, like sometimes interviews can be very like one against one, or one, like a binary relationship. But what I hear you doing is you're almost pulling in a third chair. You're like, some people might have the question of X. You're bringing in an assumed audience that's beyond the two. And so it's not just a you, it's a we, right?
Yes.
Like you are asking on behalf of other people, on behalf of an audience.
That's right.
How do you end that meaningful exchange so that you know that the person's leaving feeling that it was great to have had a chance to talk with you, that they shared comfortably and appropriately? Like how do you bring it home? How does this story get an ending that can be satisfying even if it's not complete?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's one I struggle with, I'll be honest. But the thing that I always do at the very end, I always do two things. And these are sort of just like rote mechanical things.
Yeah.
Well, not so mechanical. The first thing I do is I try to be as genuine as I can when I say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for not just the time you spent, but for saying this and this. That really connected with me. So I try to make a space at the end of the interview where I communicate back to the person the things that they said that resonated with me.
It's great.
Because I do think people go into interviews and they're a little bit unsure. Like,
Yeah.
Am I doing this right? Am I giving you something that's useful? And so just having that moment to say, yeah, this and this and this really moved me. And then the second thing I always do is I say, was there something I should have asked you that I didn't?
Great. Great closing.
Did I miss something that you really need to say? And usually they say no. But occasionally they'll be like, yeah, I really wish you had asked this, and I really want to say something about that. And you sort of give them that space.
It's great.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that, I love everything you said, is there anyone else I should speak to?
Oh,
This is
nice.
Great
classic,
question.
Classic
Amanda,
journalism.
brilliant
You
journalism.
get the connection at the end of the interview that could be the interview that changes your life or changes history. But who else should I speak to? And even in this case, since students are doing only a sort of one-off interview, who is the person in your life that you think would be most revealing if they were to tell your story, or that would be a really interesting perspective for me to include?
That's a great question.
So it's the sort of closer But it also reveals something about, oh, it's, you know, it's my neighbor, it's my daughter,
It's
it's
great.
my mother, it's my partner, whoever. And that then says something about who they are. And they also feel like they're sharing their own story. We're all very unreliable narrators of our own story, right? So who else could tell your
Super
story
smart.
well? You know?
Yeah. And it's a nice way of leaving it open for the sequel,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Like
That's right.
today's book is completed, right? But the story is not over.